participant numbers haven't been rising quite as quickly, so I think we'll get going. Welcome everyone to the Infometrics monthly economic briefing for August. I think probably like me, you're all looking forward to some of the warmer weather that's going to be coming our way soon. But for today, I'm Rob Hayes, and I'm joined by Brad Olson and Nick Brunsdon. And the webinar today is about tourism. Nick's going to be giving you a presentation about some key questions that we've been asking ourselves about the state of tourism in New Zealand, and demonstrating to you some of the data that we've been collecting and creating on an annual basis for quite a while now. So that this is our kind of opportunity to showcase some of that information. Brad's going to kick off in just a moment by giving you a kind of a national state of play for the economy, and then we'll be going over to Nick. We'll talk for about half an hour as usual, and then there'll be another half an hour for you guys to ask us questions. If you could put your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar rather than not the chat section, that makes it easier for us just to kind of focus on one pop-up window rather than looking across the two. So questions in the Q&A after about half an hour. But I'm going to start by just handing you over briefly to Brad, who's going to give you a quick overview of the national economy.
Awesome, thanks Rob. Kia ora everyone. Look, things are probably not in the position we would have hoped or expected to have seen them at this point in August. Of course, throughout the last sort of 2 months, we have seen the economy starting to get on a stronger footing. Spending activity has rebounded quite well. We've seen people out and about. We've seen that activity tick up. With the Prime Minister's announcement 2 weeks ago of community transmission in Auckland, that did turn the economic outlook a little bit on its head. Certainly did make for a reality check, I expect, for businesses. Over the week to 18 August, spending in Auckland was down 33% from a year before. So again, you've immediately cut out a huge amount of revenue across the super city, remembering that Auckland is our largest, the largest part of the economy, 38% of the likes of output, so a significant drain on resources. Nick will outline what that means from a tourism perspective shortly. Across the country, we've seen spending dip 6.4%, so again there's less money moving around New Zealand, and that has been quite clear that even outside of Auckland, in Wellington and other urban centres where we have no community transmission of COVID-19, that the level 2 restrictions have seen people react quite swiftly. People have worked proactively from home, and that has sucked a bit of the life out of some of our major urban centres. With that, we've seen the government come through with the resurgence wage subsidy. That will certainly help to push people through these tough times. But it's worth remembering that businesses don't have the same amount of support as they did last time. Going into the first lockdown, people did have more savings and more money up their sleeve. This time, businesses start in a much more vulnerable position moving forward. So we do expect that we will see job losses rise through this. And I think we're all eagerly awaiting the Prime Minister's announcement later today of where to next. You know, the options on the table seem to vary quite a lot. But I think, whatever that call was made, a very hard balance between health and the economy. The last bit of information I'll leave you with is that the Reserve Bank continues to come to the party with support. Earlier in August, they raised what they would purchase through their quantitative easing program to $100 billion. That was up from $60 billion. That $100 billion, though, being spread over 2 years rather than the $60 billion over one. What that all means, because there's a lot of big numbers there, is essentially that we will see interest rates likely head lower, and does support investment sort of moving ahead. So some very tough times remain still. We've sort of got through that post-lockdown buzz and surge of money, and we have now seen a more realistic expectation move ahead. And our quarterly economic monitor that we released last week did show for the first time just how big of a hit on the regions the economy has been battered by COVID-19, and so look out for that with our newsletter coming out probably straight after this webinar, to be honest. Rob, that's me for now. So I'll hand back to you, and I'll pop along and do some other work while watching all the insights that Nick's able to provide us.
Thanks, Brad. All right, without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Nick Brunsdon.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Brad. I'll just share my screen. Right, can you see that all right, Rob? Can you see the presentation, Rob?
Yes, I can, Nick.
Cool. I'll go ahead. Wonderful. So what I want to go through is look at tourism from, I guess, a helicopter view first, take a zoom out and look at where it's been heading and look at the big picture of where we think it's going over the next sort of 5 years, and then hone in on the now. So touch on the impact of the school holidays, how that's gone for many of our tourism hotspots. Touch on the impact of the Auckland lockdown, as Brad alluded to, and then talk about the outlook over the next sort of 6 months. So the reason why I want to touch on history is I don't want to dwell too much, but we're coming to we are at the end of what was actually an extraordinary growth cycle in our tourism sector, and it's really important to understand that because that sets the foot that we're going to decline from and then recover from. And it sort of influences what the shape of the recovery will look like. So it's a really interesting period. If we look at starting at 2010, the tourism sector came through the GFC relatively unscathed, which is somewhat unique for a sort of luxury discretionary industry. So visitor arrivals to the country jumped by 60% over the 7 years between 2012 and 2019, which is again is a substantial increase in throughput for a mature industry. We doubled the number of visitors from China. Chinese visitors started traveling in great numbers due to a growing wealthy middle class, and that was a key driver of our growth. We also found a doubling in the number of visitors from North America, which again is a mature market, but that came from increases in direct flight connections over to into Canada and into the States, rather. Besides those two major areas, we actually had growth in the number of visitors from all markets, and that was underscored by a drop in the cost of international air travel over that decade by around 15%. So that meant that it was cheaper to travel long haul, cheaper to get to New Zealand, and it made New Zealand a relatively more attractive destination. So those are all the factors that drove our impressive growth over that period, with impressive growth in both the number of visitor arrivals and the spend by them as well. However, growth actually peaked in 2016. The growth rate has been easing since then. The total number of visitors in New Zealand arriving to New Zealand was basically flat in 2019, and the number of Chinese visitor arrivals was in decline. So this is all very important to understand where we're going, because it makes it very clear that COVID or no COVID, the future is not going to be like the past. So this is our forecast for visitor arrivals into New Zealand post-COVID. Well, the orange line shows our pre-COVID forecast, which was for virtually flat growth, sort of modest growth compared to the steep growth here between 2012 and 2019. And of course, the blue is our post-COVID forecast, which is pretty devastating. A drop to virtually zero visitors over the coming year, which is no surprise given that the borders are closed. We've factored in the opening of some sort of travel bubble with Pacific Islands and Australia over early 2021, and opening of the borders to the world more generally later in 2021, on the assumption that we have some sort of a vaccine that's effective and viable and distributed by then. Of course, if we don't have a vaccine, the chances of opening our borders are relatively low. Certainly not opening them to the whole world. Beyond 2021, if you look at the shape of the recovery, I think the key feature is, firstly, it's a slow recovery that we're picking, and secondly, the end point, well, it's not an end point, but 2025, the end of the forecast period, is well below where we were in 2019 and well below where we would have been had COVID not happened. And I think this is a really important feature to understand. Given that it informs the way that the businesses will respond to the situation, to the circumstances they're in now. It signifies that it's not just one summer missed and then it's all back to normal. There's going to be a bit of a gap there, quite a quiet period. So the reason for the shape of this outlook is, first things first, we're going to be entering a global recession, one of the worst global recessions that we've seen in quite a long time, since the Great Depression in the 1930s. That means that business travel will be down. That means that households will be, household incomes will fall, and there'll be less discretionary money going around for luxuries like travelling internationally to beautiful old New Zealand. Secondly, there's going to be a loss of capacity in the aviation sector. We've seen that already with all the some of the older jet aircraft being retired, a number of jet aircraft being parked up in Australia's deserts and in the States' deserts, and they'll take some time to come back online when demand is there. We're expecting changes in the behaviour of visitors and hesitancy around travel. So we've seen that already. Auckland's a little mini lockdown compared to what we've had. It's made people give caution and think, do I really want to be travelling around when there is a chance that COVID's around our country? Well, I think over the coming few years, people will think twice about travelling internationally into places that have had the virus in large numbers, like in the States or in Europe or anywhere really. So I think that hesitancy will make people want to stay a little bit closer to home for quite some time. We've also seen people that have been locked overseas and stuck overseas in various circumstances, and I think for many of them that'll be a formative experience, and that might sort of shy them off travel for a wee while too. So the lack of volume of people moving around, possible increase in health requirements, the need to screen people as they go through the border for COVID, will drive up the cost of international travel. And that will also reduce the number of people that will travel, because there will be fewer people can afford to. On the recovery side, there's a need to, when it comes to the point of bringing these airliners out of the desert and bringing them back into service, airlines are going to have to develop their markets again from scratch. They'll be parked up for a couple of years. The world will have changed. So they'll be wanting to establish that there's sufficient demand for them to be putting on the air routes that they had in the past. I mean, if we look at our going back to the previous slide, we've had substantial growth with the American market over the past decade. A lot of that was driven by the improvements in the ability for New Zealanders and Americans to travel between the two continents. Airlines will be wanting to establish bi-directional demand, so that means they want to know that there's both, if we're talking about, for example, Auckland to San Fran, they'll want to know that there's sufficient Americans wanting to come to New Zealand, as well as sufficient New Zealanders wanting to go to America, to make a viable route with strong, steady demand. So that means that we need both tourism markets on both sides to be going. We need households on both sides to be confident in moving around and wanting to travel. And establishing all those things just takes time. And I think that's why it's going to take quite a bit of time to get our air travel capacity back to where it was, and that ultimately limits the number of people that we will get into the country. So underneath all that is really an opportunity. I mean, if we reflect on the past decade, we had that extraordinary growth, but arguably tourism was probably pushing its social license a little bit in New Zealand. We're seeing extreme concentrations of tourists and international tourists in particular locations. Think of the likes of Queenstown in particular, particularly over the summer seasons. There's strong seasonality to it. And I think it was starting to reach a tipping point for, I guess, that sort of social acceptance. And so I think going into a lower volume environment and reflecting on our experience of the past decade, it's probably a really good opportunity for the tourism sector to try and pivot towards a higher value, lower volume method of operating, and as much as possible spreading out that load across seasons across the country. So back to the here and now. School holidays. So of course, with the international borders closed, we've seen the loss of international tourists has really has caused a lot of suffering in our tourism hotspots and everywhere around the country. It's actually been really interesting to look at the data for the July school holidays, because what's happened is Kiwis they've seen that they've seen that the tourism hotspots are suffering with the lack of international tourists, and they've really responded. So what we've actually seen is spending in cities over the July school holidays this year compared to July last year was flat. So people didn't really go to the cities any more than they did in the past. But spending in, I guess, the classic tourism hotspots in particular jumped substantially over last year. So up here on the chart, for example, spending in domestic tourist spending in Mackenzie district, so like Tekapo predominantly, up over 50% compared to last year. Westland districts, so Glacier Country, up over 30%. Queenstown up by a similar proportion as well. And so it really shows a very strong behavioural change that people have made in response to these circumstances, both that they couldn't go overseas for their holiday and that they could see that these areas, it was a good time to go. So the interesting thing is that for most areas, that bump in domestic spending was through those holidays was enough to completely offset the loss of international tourists, except in a couple of places. So Queenstown, Auckland and Wellington, they're used to having so many international tourists humming around and spending, but even if Queenstown's 30% boost in domestic spending wasn't enough to offset the loss of international, so total spending in Queenstown was still down. So for now, it's great news. It helps tourism operators. It provides a bit of cash over the winter and helps them tide things over. But we do need to note that Kiwis spend differently. The data shows that. It shows that Kiwis are more likely to spend money on retail food than served food, for example. So more likely to buy a pie from a petrol station than buy it from a cafe. And so that means that a dollar spent by a Kiwi kind of carries with it less impact than a dollar spent by an international tourist. It's also worth noting that this is, for most areas, the quiet season. So, for example, if we look at the West Coast, spending in the West Coast was up 23% through the July school holidays, but the summer season is generally 1.5 to 2 times bigger than winter. So what it means is that even if Kiwis held onto their jobs and managed to keep their spending patterns up like this through the summer school holidays, that wouldn't even come close to offsetting the loss of international tourists that we're going to have. And we're going to really start to notice that, I think, over the summer period. So now I want to touch on the impact of the Auckland lockdown on tourism around the country. So the significance of the Auckland lockdown is that it's a third of the country's population. It's one of the most wealthy regions, unable to travel, and so that has a significant impact right down the length of the country. Queenstown is actually the largest destination for Aucklanders. So Aucklanders spent $350 million in Queenstown last year, and that accounted for a third of all domestic spending in Queenstown. So that's a big chunk to lose in one go. And we see the same in other in main centres, so Wellington and Christchurch. Over a fifth of their tourism spending comes from Aucklanders as well, and that will just have gone to zero at the moment. It's interesting to look at the other end of the spectrum, Thames, Coromandel and Kaipara district, it's sort of at the south and the north end of Auckland. Much smaller markets, but far more reliant on Auckland spending. Nearly half of domestic visitor spending in those areas comes from Aucklanders, so they'll be down by about a half at the moment. It's interesting to talk about this, looking at what happened last time we came out of the level 3 lockdown. So back in May, when we were transitioning down from level 4, 3, 2, 1, looking at the time it took for bookings to recover. So as soon as we came out of level 3 into level 2 in May, within the week following that, spending in Thames, Coromandel and Kaipara jumped up. So broadly what that means is as soon as people were able to, they jumped in the car and went to the beach or went to a motel in those places because it was quick and easy and it was a good spontaneous trip after spending 2 weeks locked at home with the kids. If we look a little bit further afield, places like Rotorua and Taupo, spending jumped around or came back, I should say, 1 to 2 weeks after lockdown. So that reflects that it's a little bit further away. Those places are sort of 3 or 4 hours drive from Auckland. So it takes a little bit more organisation to find the time to travel from Auckland to central North Island. It takes a bit of time to book a motel and then get things sorted. But it shows that that's sort of the lag that we might expect going forward. At the other, the furthest extreme in Queenstown took about 3 to 4 weeks for spending to pick up after the country came out of level 3. And so we'd probably expect something similar going forward. So what that means is, assuming that Auckland's lockdown is going to end as it was slated, so it's a 2-week lockdown, it means that a 2-week lockdown of Auckland can potentially lead to a 5-week lull for places like Queenstown. Of course, it is a little bit different this time because people will have forward bookings for the coming weeks. So hopefully, as soon as Auckland gets out of lockdown, people will be able to travel from Auckland on their existing bookings around the country. I think there's also been a chilling effect from this as well. I think coming out of, when we did our sort of quick transition out of 4, 3, 2, 1 level lockdowns, there's probably a bit of confidence that we'd eliminated the virus, that the country was safe to travel around, and we're able to revert to our previous habits and travel. And I think having this outbreak in Auckland has reminded us that we're probably 99.9% safe as a country, but not 100%. And so I think this will drive a little bit of caution in how people make their travel bookings going forward. I think there'll be less forward booking. People will be more likely to book maybe 2 weeks in advance rather than 2 months, knowing the potential risk of losing bookings and losing deposits and such. And it's also going to scare event organisers. So we've seen that an interesting example already is the Waimate 50, a 60-year running car race. In the past week, the organisers chose to cancel that because of the uncertainty that they could see. Not that there was an outbreak in Waimate, but they could see that their audiences, they travelled down from Auckland, from Bay of Plenty, from all over the country. If Auckland was to be locked down, that would be a third of, or a large chunk of their potential of their audiences not able to come. And so they thought, well, our event in November, not worth holding it this year because there's too much risk that our audiences will be locked down and we'll lose that revenue. So I think it's been a bit of an experience, and I think that will drive some cautious behaviour going forward, unfortunately. So just wanted to close on an outlook for the coming summer, which is a key point for the tourism sector. We've had a good winter. Kiwis have really responded to the circumstances and spent it in their own backyard. But we're going into spring. Spring's typical shoulder season. We'll get that sort of gap between winter activities and summer activities, and I think that will be a little bit light. Again, we've got this uncertainty coming out of the Auckland coming out from the Auckland outbreak, so I think people will be slightly more reluctant to travel, and that will also sort of weigh down on spending and travel through spring. Heading into summer, I think we'll continue to see a really strong response from domestic tourists choosing to travel, choosing to explore their country. And it will be a great time to do it. I've put this image up. I think this is a great one. This is Roy's Peak near Wanaka. It was sort of known on Instagram for people posing, and subject to massive queues and massive overflowing car parks in previous years. Well, this will be a great time to visit the summer will be a great time to visit Roy's Peak because there won't be the same volume of people around. I think that will really attract Kiwis out. But by summer, it's also worth noting that the wage subsidy extension will have run out. So I think the economic circumstances will start to catch up with a number of households, and that will sort of that might hold back on the spending side of things. I think also that the final note really is going into summer, the loss of international tourists will become really apparent. Going back into a typical peak season, we'll really start to recognise what we're missing and recognise what we just can't replace until the borders are open. Really, New Zealanders spent around $6.7 billion overseas last year. International tourists spent $12.5 billion in New Zealand. So even if New Zealanders were doing fine through the economically, if they spent all the money they would have spent on overseas travel in the country, it still wouldn't offset the loss of international tourists, and that's just a fact, and it's just something that we've unfortunately got to deal with. So on that note, I think hopefully this has been useful for you, and we'll hand over to Rob, and we'll go through and answer the questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. If you have any questions about anything that Nick has spoken about today, now would be the perfect time to type your questions into the Q&A function of this webinar. So the clients of ours will know that we have data on tourism spending in our regional economic profile and in our quarterly economic monitor, but there's the way that you presented this data today, Nick, it's some things in there that I've not seen before, and it's really interesting to see. We'll be making a recording of this webinar available on the client-facing side of our website. Nick will be able to put your presentation up there as well, but we have a question as whether any of the TA level data that you presented today, whether you'll be able to share that as maybe as an Excel spreadsheet for all TAs. What do you think? Yeah,
it's a good point. Some of the data will actually be coming out in a newsletter article, but it was going to still highlight a handful of areas. But we do have the ability to have charts in a newsletter where people can search their own area. So I might have a look. I'll see if I can get all of the TAs, all the areas into those charts today. If not, then yeah, we can look to see to get a spreadsheet out with that raw data.
Okay. And then Miles has asked, could we please show the slide again around projected international tourism? And did you have a question about that, Miles? I'll just, while we've got that up, we've got another question from Gary. Do we have any predictions for the number of job losses and business closures in tourism over the rest of 2020 and then 2021, and then perhaps job gains happening from about 2022? Nick?
Don't have the numbers to hand. In our forecast, we've broken things down by different sectors, so the sort of constituent parts. Accommodation and food service and such. So I don't have those numbers to hand, but we can probably put them up when we put up some of the other information along with the slides afterwards.
Yeah, we've been doing forecasts for industries across the whole economy for the next, well, initially for the next 5 years. We have even longer forecasts than that that we put into various products. So the short answer is yes, but as Nick says, we've not been specifically looking at job losses today.
I mean, it varies across the country. I think off the top of my head, it's something around 50%, close to a 50% loss in Queenstown, and a lesser loss in other centres. But broadly, it's there's the job losses in tourism around the country, of course.
Yeah, trying to think. We did our COVID report back in April, didn't we? Where we had some forecasts of employment by industry. We've been talking about revising that report in October this year. So we keep revising our forecasts, but since our April forecast, the numbers don't seem to change a lot. We've been tweaking our assumptions based on new things happening, mainly new government policies or government spending, but none of it seems to have really changed our forecast to any great degree. So we've been holding off on releasing another set of COVID reports. But we think that by October, we'll have a lot more information, a lot more real data, historical data to feed into our model. So we should see a significant revision in our forecast. So you'll see more of our forecasts around that time. Tim has a question. With the reduced international visitors over the next 5 years, do you see a significant reduction in tourism operators happening when the wage subsidy comes off?
Yes is the short answer, of course. Yeah. I think what we've seen so far is that some of the larger and I guess more corporatized tourism operators have I guess planned workforce reductions pretty early in the piece when they could they appreciated what was happening due to COVID. So the large hotels, organisations like Skyline, like the ski fields. And such have been laying people off already, and I think the thing that sets them out is A, those are organisations that have access to professional advisors, and B, the organisations that have a forward order book that can give them a little bit of a glimpse into the future as what the future is going to be like, and they were able to see that, okay, well, our bookings for our hotel, bookings for our tours have decimated. We can see what's happening. And so I think a lot of those job losses and those sorts of businesses will have been crystallised already. What I think will come will be the downstream businesses that are heavily reliant on tourism, but potentially don't have that booking pipeline to inform them of what the future's like. Thinking cafes, restaurants, bars, they don't really have any view of what demand is going to be. They really just deal with what they get on the day. And I think those are the places that are probably be the next cab off the rank to say, well, actually, yeah, that those visitors aren't coming back. We need to make those decisions.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we'll expect some pretty substantial losses there.
Yeah, I've been hearing about businesses that are kind of shutting down, maybe temporarily, with a view to setting up again once things once the recovery begins. And I don't know specifically about tourism operators, but I think the ability for the sector to recover will partially be based around these businesses, their ability to kind of shut up shop for a year or two and then start again. That they've got the premises that they need, they've got the staff that they need, they've got the various bits of capital that they need to quickly ramp up again. It's that ability to kind of close up and then open again. rather than the economy, rather than the sector going through a process of a number of operators falling by the wayside and new operators needing to step in and start anew. There's definitely going to be a transition for the sector. It's just how easily and how quickly can the sector go through that transition. The more I see, I've been looking at a few things recently about the availability of a vaccine, and the more I see of that, the more pessimistic I'm getting. There's these questions being asked about the speed with which these vaccines are being developed, the efficacy of these vaccines, but I think more importantly, the ability to produce these vaccines on scale and literally vaccinate the whole world. I mean, I can't see how that's going to happen even in 2 or 3 years. I guess we might get to a point where people would have a stamp on their passport to say that they've been recently vaccinated. Perhaps you might have to have a test before you fly. I can't see any other way that we can safely open up our borders prior to the whole world being vaccinated. It's kind of hard to get your head around. So the idea that we're going to open our borders again within 12 months, to me, seems at the moment a little optimistic. Maybe a partial opening to certain people, but I don't see us being able to open our borders again to the whole world within 12 months or even 2 years, because it's going to take that long to get people vaccinated. Anyway, moving on to some more questions. Do we have any data regarding ethnicity? Particularly, is it expected that Maori will be adversely affected in the low-skilled jobs in the tourism sector? If not, where might we be able to obtain this information? We have a couple of products where we use our Maori ethnicity data. We have a tab on our regional economic profile, which is devoted specifically to Maori, and there's a labour market tab within that, a Maori labour market tab, where we have a lot of information about Maori employment by industry. We have put together recently some Maori forecasts of Maori employment by industry. That went in our recent set of COVID reports, and that will be, I think we're going to be revising that again in October. And we've also got our Te Matapai product, which is a product specifically designed for iwi and councils who have a particular focus on Maori, and that's specifically about the Maori labour market. And you can get a lot of information there about the Maori employment outlook across a range of industries. So thanks for that question, Jackie. A few more. What do you think the longer term impact will be for areas that are primarily relied on domestic tourism? Are we expecting a drop in domestic tourism, a rise, or stability? I can see what the prognosis is for places that relied on international, but domestic seems more foggy. It's a good question, Miles. Any thoughts, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment we're probably in a bit of a honeymoon phase. I mean, looking beyond the tourism sector first, we've seen, I think, coming out of lockdown, we were expecting spending to be a lot lower than it was, and so I think us and other economists have been quite surprised at the strength of domestic spending, and I think we've started to understand that. I think that's the wage subsidy has really, postponed the economic reality of COVID, and it's probably postponed some of the job losses. And what that's meant is households haven't really felt the impact of a loss of income to the extent that we might have expected based on the loss of economic activity. So what that means is we've had a really strong winter in the domestic tourism space, because households are surprisingly still confident in their own circumstances. However, going forward, we think, we get rid of the wage subsidy extension. We've had the effects of the Auckland lockdown. That's probably going to push things down further, and people, for a number of people, unfortunately, economic reality will start to catch up, and I think that will just sort of put a bit of a dampener on domestic spending. So I think we've probably, July school holidays are probably about as best as it was going to get. And I think it will probably come back a little bit from that. But it will still be ahead of what it was, because, again, people don't have an alternative. If you can't go to the Gold Coast, then you're just going to have to find somewhere else in New Zealand that will make do. So what I think that means is that for the next wee while, for several years, I think we'll see a slightly elevated level of domestic tourism going forward, just reflecting that the loss of choices, but nothing particularly exuberant, reflecting the fact that economic circumstances are soft. I mean, domestic tourism and thinking about districts like Waimakariri Miles that are within a short drive of a main population centre, those are the sweet spots, because if you're uncertain about your economic circumstances, you're not going to book flights and hotels and all sorts at the other end of the country, but you might just do a weekend away or an afternoon away with the kids just down the road, and those are probably the most viable forms of tourism in a soft economic time.
Yeah, we've been a little different to a number of other economic forecasters, Treasury being the one that springs most readily to mind. We've said from the start that the recovery from this is going to take longer than most of the forecasters think. We've always said it's going to be more like a U-shaped recession than a V-shaped recession. And I think that really and that view hasn't changed in the last few months. And I think that provides the context for what Nick is saying, that it is going to be we're going to see the worst is still yet to come in a lot of ways once the wage subsidy comes off, etc. There may have been a bump post-lockdown, but we still think we've got a lot of hard yards ahead of us before the recovery happens, and it'll be a relatively slow recovery, and that really provides the context for domestic tourism, as Nick was saying, because the health of the economy really underpins people's willingness to go on holiday. Another question, what might the tourism outlook look like if the government allowed some air bridges or other more lenient measures to bring in international tourists? I think there's a reference there. There's been talk of an air bridge between the UK and Spain, for example. Would it be worth it for New Zealand?
I mean, I think assuming it's done safely, of course, it'd be worth it. I mean, it's an increase in visitors and visitor revenue compared to what we'd have otherwise. So it's as long as we can do them, that's great. I think we're probably feeling as a country feeling pretty confident about doing some Pacific air bridges a couple of weeks ago, and I think that confidence has dropped down a bit with the outbreak in Auckland, the outbreak in Melbourne, and such. In general terms, yes, they'd make an impact. They'd help, but I think there's still going to be let's say we had free flow with Australia. I think the volume to travel will still be limited. Again, all those factors around reluctancy to travel are still going to apply. Economic circumstances have deteriorated. They will deteriorate further, so households will have less to spend. So there'll be fewer people that can afford to travel over those air bridges, so to speak, and there'll be people that will be reluctant to travel over those air bridges for health concerns, even if it is 99.9% safe in those and where they're going to.
And I think let's assume these bridges are a two-way thing. So more New Zealanders might decide to travel overseas. So when there was serious talk of a trans-Tasman bubble, I think we felt that New Zealand would be the beneficiary of that. There'd be more people coming over here from Australia than there would New Zealanders going over there. And the talk of a bubble with the Cook Islands, that would probably benefit the Cook Islands more than New Zealand, because there'd be more of us going over there for our holidays than coming over here. So it would depend on who the partner country was. It would assume that the bridge would be a two-way thing. It could be a benefit to New Zealand, or it could be a disbenefit, depending on the numbers of people going each way and the amount of money that they'd be spending. So another question, will COVID-19 change the location of tourism activity, for example, away from mass tourism places like Rotorua and Queenstown? And if so, how should we prepare for this?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think at the heart of it is the heart of the question to me is to what extent are tourism patterns driven by, I guess, by pull factors, so people saying come here, come to Queenstown, advertising campaigns and such, and how much is driven by push factors, so people wanting to go, people seeing it on Instagram, seeing Roy's Peak and wanting to go to Wanaka, because we've been trying as a country to spread tourism around the country, disperse it more. We've been trying to spread it around around seasons, and it's probably had limited success to date. So I think that would suggest that there's a strong push factor where people decide they want to come, and so they come. And so I think that's probably would lead me towards saying that I don't see that changing substantially. I think people will still want to come to our big hotspots. It's probably more a case of getting them to maybe spend a few nights at areas around them, and rather than not go to Queenstown or Rotorua altogether.
Yeah. Is there a danger of a self-fulfilling spiral where tourism businesses fold or hibernate so consumers spend in other sectors or save their money, since the tourism options are less good than they recently were?
That's a really interesting point, and actually, heading down to Queenstown in a couple of days myself, and noticed that some of the operators had cut down their hours, and to the point where it wasn't possible to do activities like the gondola within my itinerary. A very interesting point. I think for areas like Queenstown and Rotorua, those sort of very international tourism hotspots are quite unique, and so I think we're going to see that behaviour in those spots, and it's not ideal, but it's sort of understandable. I suspect, by and large, the rest of the country isn't, I think on average, more than sort of 2/3 of our tourism spending comes from domestic visitors, if we average across the whole country. So what that would suggest is that on average across most areas, there's still a solid base of domestic tourists to keep the doors open and keep the lights on. In those tourism hotspots like Queenstown, where it's flipped around the other way, where 2/3 of the tourism revenue comes from internationals, it's probably a pretty fair response for operators to hibernate or shut down hours and such, and So I can understand why that's happening. It is a little bit chicken and egg, because obviously they're not going to see the demand for those times when they're closed if they're not taking bookings. But I don't think it would send us on too much of a self-fulfilling spiral, because the operators we've seen so far are still providing some offerings. They're just cutting back the hours.
Yeah. We just noticed a question in the chat part. Might not be the correct forum, but what access could tourism operators have to the visitor levy funds?
I'm not an expert on the visitor levy, so probably not too sure what to comment there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think the levy was designed really for kind of tourism infrastructure, wasn't it? Marketing and other things like that. It's a tricky one to kind of ring fence money like that and give it back to operators. I guess if you were going to do that, you would have to come up with some kind of a formula as to how the money could be dished out. I can see the benefit of it, but I guess in a sense it would kind of be just a replacement for an existing policy like the wage subsidy. If that's what it was going to be used for, in which case maybe it's better just to kind of keep the wage subsidy going. I imagine anyway the visitor levy figures would be looking pretty dire at the moment anyway. It hasn't been going that long, has it, Nick? It's only kind of towards the end.
Years, I think.
Yeah. So there's a question as to how much money there would be in the pot for that anyway.
I mean, and there's a broader question of if you were to distribute money, whether it's from the visitor levy or whether it's from general taxation, like what we're seeing for the major tourism attraction funding, is what's the funding actually going to achieve? And so I think there's, if you look at the outlook and if you take our forecast at face value for visitors, it's not feasible to pay businesses to hibernate or to just tread water for 2 to 3 years or more. I think where there's possibly, if you were going to be applying funding, it would be more helping operators pivot towards, I guess, maybe more flexible operations that can handle a lower level of international visitors, or operators that can sort of pivot towards offerings that suit domestic tourists more.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got through all the questions, so I might bring this to a close. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks very much for some really insightful and interesting questions. Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.